I just want to do a quick I'm trying to connect all the talks, all the webinars we have this spring. I'm trying to, and with winter, spring, I'm trying to connect them to the Clean Water Act. It's the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act coming up in October. There's going to be a whole bunch of events around the state this summer and fall to celebrate this landmark legislation that first happened in 1972. And I'd just like to show these pictures to remind everybody how bad things were in the 70s. And it's no wonder there was a huge environmental, the environmental movement was born in the 70s because of things like this that we were looking at, steaming rivers and industrial pollution. So the Clean Water Act made great strides to clean up industrial sources of waste like this. And then it was really the Clean Water Act identified or acknowledged that non-point source pollution, so pollution not coming from a source like an industrial plant or a source, was an important, really important and critical. But it was really not until 1987 when amendments to the Clean Water Act happened, and they added to this what we call a Section 319. That's a grant program that really focuses on non-point source pollution, brings a lot of money into the state every year for organizations to do watershed surveys, identify non-point sources of pollution, so those small sources of erosion around property and surrounding a watershed that contribute. They're small, but when you add lots of them together, they make a big difference. So that's the connection with today's speaker. Is he'll be talking about living shorelines, which is a way to create the natural kind of buffer that would be there in an undeveloped property. So just some photos here of buffers in progress. Vegetative buffers are hugely having that buffer of vegetation between the land and the water, huge tool, a very good tool to implement to reduce that non-point source pollution into the water. So Peter, I'll talk more about that, but that's our connection to the Clean Water Act for today's talk. I'll just do a quick introduction. We actually have two speakers. So Peter will start off. Peter's a certified professional in erosion and sediment control. He has more than 40 years of experience working on all sorts of different projects in the US. He's made presentations across the globe and done a lot of writing. He's spoken to the International Erosion Control Association, Land Improvement Contractors of America, lots of other conference presentations that hopefully you saw in his bio. He actually lives in Topsom, so he's local to Maine. So welcome, Peter, and thanks for joining us. Our second speaker then is Addie Halligan. She's an environmental specialist in the Watershed Management Unit at DEP. And in this role, she works to restore and protect water bodies impaired and threatened by non-point source pollution. So she looks at and analyzes water quality data. She surveys for non-point source pollution around the watershed. She works with communities and provides technical assistance in the design and installation of conservation practices. So I was really grateful for Peter for coming in to give his perspective, and then Addie will add some more information and specifically to Maine and how Maine is working on and how they're implementing the living shoreline concept in projects within Maine. So thank you both for being here. And I will stop my screen share and pass it on to you, Peter.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you all for being here. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, we're not sure why I'm not going into full screen mode here, but should be.
I know, we practiced it. We even
we did. And
twice.
Hey, Drew, is there something we can do to get into full screen mode? For some reason, I can't.
I'm unsure, to be honest.
Okay.
Oh, look at what about at the bottom in the little orange bar? There's that That's how I usually start. There's the little, looks like a screen. That one. Will that do
Okay,
it?
right there. Slide sorter, reading view,
Next one over. That one.
right there, slideshow.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay,
Yeah, all right. Thanks.
hooray. Yeah, and I can even advance it, so great. Well, Susan and Drew, thank you for the all the help in the background and the opportunity to speak to this group. And mostly though, thanks to, of course, Addie as well, but thanks to all of you for caring so much about Maine lakes. This is lakes have been important to me since I was a little kid and growing up in New Hampshire. And I lived in Keene, New Hampshire, surrounded by lakes and just loved them. And at the time had no idea that virtually all the practices that I saw were wrong. But this was back in the 1950s and 60s. And basically lakes were a place where we went and we basically tried to impose our will on them. Now we know better, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But again, thank you all very much for caring about this very important topic. And as Susan mentioned earlier, that is correct. I think living shorelines is a concept that's really catching on, not just inland, but also, by the way, on our ocean front properties as well. And there's a huge movement in that direction all over the country. So if we look back at things like vintage postcards like you're seeing here, and Bolton Landing is actually on Lake George, beautiful place. And you can see in this particular postcard, I guess from 1911, that at Lamb's Lakeshore Cabins, they had done a very good job of taming the waterfront. So you can see there's a nice sandy beach right down to the edge of the water. And then this dock system has been installed, people having a good time. We've learned some things since then, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Sometimes I start off my sessions with this slide and ask people for a one-word reaction to this. And I get a lot of things like gorgeous, beautiful, but then every once in a while I get one that is a little bit more on the mark, at least in my mind, and is when people say unsustainable and not friendly to the nature's cycle, nature's feeding cycle. So yeah, this looks great, but really this is just basically, you can see that we're basically just taming the waterfront with these rock barriers. We've got turf grass lawns pretty much right down to the water's edge. Again, this is not really a sustainable design, but this is what we've done throughout the industrial era. But we are learning, which is the positive thing. One of the most common things is when we have a problem of erosion at the water's edge, we install what's known as rock or rock riprap in this case. Now you take a look at this and you think, okay, is this effective for erosion control? I would say yes. Is this attractive? My opinion would be no. Is this doing anything positive in terms of the natural cycle, the natural food chain of nature in that transition zone at the water's edge? Absolutely not. Is this a place where I want to take my 3-year-old grandchild maybe for a swim? Well, it's not a very safe place to do that either, is it? So, but this is done commonly, and it is effective. And again, it's something that a lot of our coastal practices in the industrial era were doing just this. Effective, yes. Attractive, again, in my opinion, no. And is this in any way mimicking the way nature normally took care of this shoreline? Absolutely not. These are articulating concrete blocks, and again, just my opinion. This looks terrible, and it's doing absolutely nothing for the natural cycles that take place in that very important transition zone from our waterways to our shorelines. And again, we've tamed we've pretty much tamed Mother Nature here, and this allows us, of course, to have our Adirondack chairs right on the edge of this stone abutment here that we're looking at, the stone retaining wall. But we've created a totally sterile environment at the water's edge. And sheet piling does much the same thing. Again, is this effective in terms of erosion control and protecting that very valuable piece of land behind it? Yes. Is this doing anything positive in that very important transition zone, which nature did a great job of taking care of for centuries until we intervened? No, it's not doing a very good job of taking care of those natural cycles. So what do we want to do? Well, I think one of the big things we've learned post-industrial era, and as Susan mentioned, 50 years after the Clean Water Act was passed, is that we need to design with nature as a partner, not design against nature. And I think pretty much, in my opinion, what we did during the industrial era was we worked against nature. We altered 98% of the rivers in the United States in one way or another, either with filling in wetlands adjacent to these rivers, straightening out channels, damming them. 98% of those bodies of water have been altered. And we've developed some particularly bad habits at on our lakes and ponds, and we'll talk more about those. But one of the most important things that we've interrupted can be seen in the picture on the right-hand side. Excuse me. Those overhanging trees have such an important role. Think about those overhanging trees that are there naturally. These would not be invasive species, but these would be species that are there naturally, and they're dropping every year thousands and thousands of insect larvae into that water, feeding the fish. In turn, feeding that whole kind of natural cycle that we see over on the left, where you see your producers, composers, decomposers, herbivores, first level carnivores, top level carnivores. All of these are very interdependent on one another, and the minute we interrupt this cycle, we disrupt this whole cycle, we start to create a more sterile environment at the water's edge, to the detriment of that waterway. And of course, one of the things we love to do is to have turf grass right down to the water's edge. We want to have that manicured lawn right down to the water's edge, just like our neighbor does. And then, is it any wonder that we're getting erosion at the water's edge? Because we've taken out the native vegetation that was doing a very good job of maintaining that shoreline, and we're relying on very thin, very shallow rooted vegetation, turf grass, to hold that shoreline. And of course, with just a little bit of wind driven wave action, or waves caused by wakes from boating, or whatever it is, it doesn't take much to get that erosion going that you're seeing at the water's edge. And of course, in extreme cases, you get this. And then just think about this as maybe being an agricultural field, and the ability of this to transport nutrients, fertilizers, and so forth directly into our water. What ways, we're setting ourselves up for a world of hurt. And of course, this is even worse. And we end up with severe erosion, and of course, ultimately, we can lose property. And we can also get really, really detrimental algae bloom as a result of nutrients being fed directly into these waterways. And of course, this is to the detriment of not only of aquatic life, but also of recreation and all other practical uses of that waterway, from drinking water, you name it. So what have we learned? Well, one of the things we've learned, first of all, is that native grasses, native vegetation is much more deep rooted than non-natives. And that is one of our huge problems we've had at the water's edge, is the introduction of invasive species. So turf grass, of course, fescue turf, you can look over, kind of look on the center line just left where it says fescue turf. Very, 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 very shallow rooted. But then take a look at some of these natives over on the right, and you can see the difference. So these types of plants are designed to, by nature, designed to thrive in that environment. Turf grass definitely is not. Where does this whole idea of turf grass come from? It really came from the British Empire, where they built these magnificent castles and buildings, and they decided, gee, we really need to have a nice manicured lawn all around this. And of course, this is taken off, and I'm as guilty as anyone. I have a lawn at my house. And most of us probably on this call do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly is a bad thing when we decide we need to have that from our cottages on our lakes and ponds all the way down to the water's edge. And again, this is what we end up with. And so this is really, this is bad in a lot of ways. One, we're going to get continuous erosion and sedimentation caused by that wave action. Rainwater is going to carry any nutrients or any fertilizers or any other things that get into our, including sediment that get into our lawns, is ultimately going to be washed into our lakes and ponds. This is a big problem. And quite simply, the average root depth for tall fescue turf grass is 2 to 3 inches. Native grasses up to 16 inches. Now, by the way, I'm going to speed up here a little bit because I realize I've got about 10 minutes left and we've got a lot to talk about. So really just going to try to give you folks the big picture here. First of all, invasive species, a very bad thing, and very expensive to deal with. And in that natural food chain, just think about what you see here a little bit. The importance of those larvae that are produced in native vegetation, drop into the pond. These are the kind of changes that this is the kind of consequences. But think of this one chickadee making that 146 trips a day. Think also about how expensive it is to do eradication of invasive species once you have them. What is very inexpensive is prevention. And I guess if we were putting another timeline over there, we would talk about education too. But as we work up that cycle, you can see it gets more and more and more expensive once those natives get hold. And of course, what we've learned is that traditional lakeshore development reduces the food supply for fish. Pollinators are much more likely to forage on the nectar of native plants. 96% of all birds depend entirely on insect protein to feed their young. And I'll let you read the rest of them, but I think the study one bullet is important too. Developed lakes had severe adverse impact on trout population health and growth. So what are some of the tools and techniques? Well, these are something called coconut fiber logs, which are made of coconut fiber, highly compressed, and these will buy us some time on a shoreline. And depending on the composition and the compaction of these, they can last from 5 to 7 to 9 years, allowing us to get a good stand of vegetation on that shoreline. And they can be used in conjunction with erosion control blankets that you're seeing on these slopes in an application like you're seeing here. Here's probably the most prototypical application right here on the water's edge at the high water mark, buying us some time to get a good stand of vegetation established on that shoreline. Again, this is a biodegradable erosion control blanket. Seed goes down, the blanket goes over the top, we vegetate it. This is kind of what we're going for. We're going for shorelines that look natural. This is actually a design that I helped a golf course designer with. This was in Illinois, he wanted his ponds to look natural. So we used a tool called turf reinforcement mats to actually make those ponds look natural, even all 4 of them were actually hand-dug man-made ponds. But if they didn't do something to armor along the edge of those ponds and just tried to establish their golf course turf, for example, they'd had the same problem that I showed you earlier. Here's what vegetated fiber rolls look like after they've got a chance to really get established. And you can see, again, they're buying us some time, allowing us to get a good stand of vegetation along that water's edge. And this slide just shows you really a lot of different tools at play. You've got a little at the bottom. You've got a little bit of toe protection at the water's edge with some rock lined with geotextile fabric. And then you can see there's a fascine, which is basically a bundle of sticks at the base. And you can see live staking. We'll talk more about some of these techniques as we go along. We have some techniques also for just kind of dealing with problems caused by flowing water in our streams. This is something called a cross vein. And these are actually, this is a cross vein again. What cross veins do is they oppose the flow and they help center the flow. That reduces the impact, the erosive impact of that water on the shoreline. So basically what we're doing is we're looking downstream in this particular slide, and we're looking at a trough in the center with basically these two veins that are opposing that flow, helping to center that flow and to take the stress off those embankments. This is the cross veins really in action, and what they do is they create artificial rapids. This was a particular project that I visited a number of years ago. It's a bend on the Sandy River in Farmington Falls, Maine. And after Hurricane Irene, this is what it looked like. And they installed something called root wad, boulder, and logs as a revetment around that curve, because the first thing they had to do was solve that problem at the water's edge. And this has now been in place for about 11 years, and it's doing very, very well. So you can see these root wads. Think of pulling a big tree out of the ground and just sticking those root wads out into the water. They're actually helping to break up some of that erosive action of that water on that outside bend that you're looking at here on the Sandy River. So another illustration really of the same thing. We're on the bend of a river. Rock veins we talked about. Rock veins basically are just on one side of a flow, but their job is to basically pull the flow away from an eroding embankment. So here's some rock veins that are again opposing the flow and taking the stress off of that outside bend. Here's another illustration of the same thing. What happens is the water strike these and they basically flip the energy more back towards the center of the current. Then that allows us to do some mitigation on those embankments as you see on the left-hand side. Rock veins again. Along your lake and pond shorelines, there's various ways of doing what they call soil wraps, and they can be done in a variety of ways. A lot of times they're done with brush, but they can also be combined with geotextile fabrics, turf reinforcement mats, and other alternative treatments at the base that you're seeing on the left-hand side. Brush mattresses, living crib walls, willow spiling. In this particular one just shows a whole bunch of things, including live staking, where you drive a live stake in and then it sprouts. Again, this is just showing you a variety of treatments that could be done on that water's edge, all really fit into this larger picture of living shorelines. Coconut fiber logs, kind of before and after. Fascines. In this case, fascine bundles are staked in with erosion control fabric in between. Again, we're trying to get away from this. And by the way, our access to is important. We understand that. But if you're going to do an access to a pond or a lake, make sure it meanders so that you have plenty of places to get rid of effluent run that might be carried, like fertilizers, nutrients, and so forth, that will be carried along this. If we do these in a zigzag pattern, we can basically absorb a lot of this before we get to that water's edge. What we want to do is get an appearance like this that looks natural. And if we can do this in such a way that we can still maintain our views, we can still maintain our access. That's really the key. So as we look ahead, think about reduction of turf grasses, meandering access, native vegetation, and ultimately try to, what the best designers are doing now is they're going back into saying, you know, how did this look historically, and how can I use the toolbox that we now have available to us to get us there? If I can get back to that, that's what I'm trying to do. I want a natural appearance with native vegetation, and I want to create that solid, restore that solid ecosystem that existed at that very fragile area between the water and the land. And there are some other tools out there like porous pavement that we used here that help. And if we can avoid, obviously, this particular pavement is actually absorbing water, this is repelling water and going to send it somewhere else. And ultimately, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for a sustainable, attractive shoreline. And that's the great thing about living shorelines is they're attractive. They're less expensive than to construct than hard armor. And they'll get us to the promised land where we need to go. And that's a moose. And I'm at the end of my time. So thank you very much for listening. And I'll turn it back to Drew and Susan and Addie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. I think there's some questions coming in and we'll come back to them at the end. I know you were rushing through to make our time. So, you know, we might go back to some of those slides
Sure.
to ask some questions at the end. But I appreciate you moving through because I think the question, you know, having time for Q&A is really key for these kinds of gatherings. So thank you.
Agreed. Yeah.
And thank you so much. And I think Addie is here. I know Addie's here, but yeah, okay, Addie, it's all yours. I think if you just share, it'll take it away from Peter. Thanks.
That worked. Yep.
All right. Thanks. Addie.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Peter, for another wonderful presentation. I always enjoy learning more from you each time. As Susan mentioned, I'm Addie Halligan. I'm an environmental specialist at the Watershed Management Unit at DEP. And so our unit oversees the non-point source program. And within that program, we oversee the water pollution control grants, sometimes referred to as 319 grants. These are grants to prevent and reduce non-point source pollution to Maine water resources. And today I'll be sharing an update on a policy we've been developing to limit the use of riprap, which Peter kind of alluded to some of the negative impacts, and I'll kind of add a little bit and echo some of his main points in my presentation as well. And then I wanted to share a few projects that have been funded through our 319 program that are utilizing living shoreline techniques for slope stabilization. So the intention of developing this policy is really reflective of our evolving understanding of lakes and stream ecosystems. So the natural shoreline has a few main components, and the focus of today's, for the focus of my presentation today, is in this littoral zone. And so within this zone, as much as 90% of the species in the lake either pass through or live in this littoral zone. So this is the zone from about the water's edge to roughly where the sunlight no longer penetrates to the lake bottom. And so this the water's edge is also a focal point, again, as Peter shared in his presentation, for human activity. So while we may not intend it, or some of the past practices that we thought were beneficial, it's easy for humans, we realize, to interfere with the natural processes of this littoral zone. So the conventional shoreline development that cleared the native vegetation to build homes and plant lawns led to bank instability and other compounding problems for both the properties and for water quality. So hardening this critical ecosystem can have many negative effects, as we realize that everything kind of in life and within the littoral zone are connected. As Peter also highlighted in his presentation, riprapping entire shorelines can impact the habitat. It can cover existing natural habitat that those 90% of species utilize in various manners. It disrupts the terrestrial and aquatic connectivity, acting as a barrier and an abrupt change between habitats that many animals can use for food and rest and building nests. And riprap can also retain more heat than soil. That, combined with the removal of the canopy and the buffer, can create warmer microclimates. So in these photos, these demonstrate and highlight an undercut, which maybe could be seen as sometimes seen as an erosion issue, but it's shaded. It creates an area for fish species, for instance, to live. But when we cut it back and put riprap on it, you can see that the removal of the canopy and the heat, the stones basking in the sun, retaining heat, can create kind of a warmer microclimate. In addition to the habitat and thermal impacts, these can also deflect wave and ice energy and redirect it instead of absorbing the way more living shorelines are capable of doing. And from a social aspect, they are highly visible, and I think it can create an unnecessary demand, and folks see it on other properties on their lakes and kind of wonder why they can't use that management practice. But oftentimes we're finding that using riprap, we sometimes run into issues where it was not typically installed properly, whether that's the lack of a meaningful buffer. That is, I realize my cursor's in the wrong spot. A lack of a meaningful buffer above that riprap area. That is really the integral part of allowing those deep roots to create stabilization, and or incorrect installation or materials like these more cobbly like stones that are more likely to roll. So we see that it's often overused or sometimes installed incorrectly. So you may be surprised to see that some of these photos are landscapes directly adjacent to one another. A stark contrast can be seen between a stable vegetated lakeshore and its directly adjacent unstable eroding lakeshore where native vegetation had been removed and high human use had escalated the impacts. So conventional shoreline development cleared the native vegetation, which led to some of this bank instability. Well, we understand that wave and ice action can intensify it. That we also recognize that kind of what happened on the site and upland are also contributing to this unstable slope here. And just another example of buffered shorelines on one side of a property, on the other side of the property, and then the property itself and the consequences of kind of development in limited lawn and limited buffer and stabilization techniques. So all this is to kind of give you the background as to the why we are our program in our 5-year NPS management plan wanted to develop a policy that limit the use of riprap with 319 funds. And I do want to be explicit that this is not a DEP-wide policy. Well, I work for DEP. This is specifically just for projects that are funded through our 319 grants program. So we did create a draft policy and sent it out to project partners and received some very helpful, constructive feedback. So we are planning to transition more to a performance standard instead of a prescriptive policy, because we recognize that there's a difference that some of these living shoreline techniques may need to use riprap as a material. There's appropriate uses of it as a material in combination with some of these techniques. But what we really want to do is restrict it as like a practice, as riprapping an entire shoreline due to the negative impacts I had described earlier. So we're still working on this. It'll look something like this is our desired outcome, and if you follow X, Y, and Z principles and guidelines, then we should be able to create something that we all agree on. So over the past year, we have been signaling this shift to our grantees, and so I just wanted to highlight a few projects that have shifted from including riprap shorelines as a BMP to incorporating these living shoreline techniques. I have to admit this is going to be a little bit of a teaser because all 3 of the projects I'm sharing are either in design phase or about to be installed. So I guess this is a way to tell you to stay tuned, and we're going to learn from these, and we're going to have lessons to share with folks, and hopefully a good outcome. But the first one I wanted to share is a 319 grant funded project on Cross Lake. So this is an impaired lake in Aroostook County, and the grantee for this project is Aroostook County. And they're working in partnership with Friends of Cross Lake, St. John Valley Soil and Water Conservation District. And if I'm missing any project partners, I'm sure there's others involved. Kathy Hoppy is the grant agreement administrator for this project that shared this project with me. So, and part of their work plan, so there are many elements to a work plan, but in this, as part of it, were 15 NPS non-point source sites experiencing shoreline erosion, and that will be utilizing nature-based solutions to address erosion issues. They recently just put this project out to bid for a consultant to design and engineer these solutions, and they received 5 bids, which we felt was an impressive, and told us that here in Maine there are folks with experience and desire to work on these projects. And so the consultant they chose was GEI Consultants. So these 15 sites that were incorporated into their work plan were all identified in a watershed survey, and NPS issues included shoreline undercut causing erosion, and surface sheet erosion, and an inadequate lack of shoreline vegetation. And this picture, I really feel like it demonstrates how when no vegetated buffer is added above the riprap, so an improper installation is not creating the structure, the root structure is not there to create stabilization. So before jumping into stabilizing the shoreland, I want to emphasize the importance of managing runoff at its source. So as we saw in earlier photos, when the buffer was intact and the shoreline was stable, then when the buffer had been altered or the site had been developed, then the shoreline was impacted. So there are a few conservation practices, or sometimes we call them best management practices, that can help deal with runoff at the source. So anywhere from roof runoff, utilizing I lost my cursor, utilizing a drip line trench, infiltration steps to create a stable path that doesn't have minimal impact, water bars, for instance, to divert water off driveways and roads, and paths even. And so there are, and at the end of this presentation, I have resources to see all of the other conservation practices that homeowners can install typically on their own. So emphasis on dealing with runoff above the shoreline, but since we're focused on the shoreline, we'll dive into those. So again, since an engineer was just hired, there aren't plans and designs for these yet that I know of, but I wanted to share a few best management practices that we maybe recommend given our performance standard change we're hoping to establish. So first off is cutting back and regrading the slope to a stable angle, seeding it with native species, and covering it with erosion control blankets. And something Peter also mentions is these core logs can also be incorporated to break up the slope and slow flow, trap the organic materials, and eventually break down and help build up that soil over time. And these can also be plugged with plants to also create vegetation with deep roots to further stabilize the site. A couple more techniques, to check my time. A couple more techniques, perhaps in combination with cutting back the slope, is using live stakes. So these are woody shrub cuttings that root quickly once planted in moist to wet soils, and they make a really good low-cost source of plant material for stabilizing and restoring shoreland vegetation. And these can be used in various manners. So one example on the left is dense planting, or on the right is bundling them together to create a wattle that's laid horizontally that'll break up the slope. So these are fast rooting cuttings, and they'll root and sprout branches all along their length. And then I just wanted to share a couple projects that have been implemented, and these are from Sally Soul with the New Hampshire MPS program. So these combine a few techniques, including the live stakes. They're kind of hard to see, but the live stakes, the erosion control mats, there's actually live stakes within what's actually the fabric encapsulated or fabric encapsulated soil lifts, which I will be mentioning in a few minutes. And then next up, I wanted to highlight a change that was made in the Watchuk Lake Phase 1 project. The Watchuk Lake is in Standish, a threatened lake that includes project partners Watchuk Lake Association, the town of Standish, Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District, and FB Environmental. And so there was one private road project that I felt like a small but really important change, because they were willing to adopt in our thinking, and went from a rip wrap in an undercut right here to planning to install a coir log instead. So the use of the coir log in this undercut with a slope will be it'll be cut back to a 2-to-1 ratio, covered with erosion control blanket, seeded, and may look like this in the future as it becomes established. And lastly, a fairly large-scale project is on Sebago Lake. This lake is on our MPS priority list because it has outstanding water quality and is a Maine drinking water supply. So the grantees for this project is the Portland Water District, and they're working with Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District and Sebago Lake State Park. And they hired Ty and Bond to do the engineering. And so this project is at the Sebago Lake State Park. It's a stabilization project, so it's going to be utilizing multiple living shoreline techniques. The angle of this photo maybe doesn't do it justice, but I tried to point some arrows to some of the locations. So over 800 feet of heavily used area along the swimming beaches are experiencing severe shorefront erosion due to waves from recreational boating, foot traffic, and this site has highly erodible soils. So from 2002 to 2015, they lost approximately 10,500 square feet of shorefront loss. So in the interest of time and simplicity, I won't go over this whole plan, but I'm just going to highlight a few techniques from this project. So first are these fabric encapsulated soil lifts. This is a technique that encases soil with erosion control blankets or coir woven fabric to build terraces to restore a stable bank. And you can plant those live stakes between these, or they will plant live stakes between the lifts in addition to native vegetation on top as well. And just a couple precedents to envision what this final product might look like. Next up is their engineered log jams. Sometimes I like to put the plans in, but it's in a short presentation, hard to understand it all, so I'll show you the pretty picture instead. So this is the process of keying in logs into the banks and leaving the root wads exposed. It's designed to kind of simulate the function of a naturally occurring log jam, which allows for sediment deposition and slope stabilization, and will also provide ecosystem services as well, like forage and refuge for species. And the last technique I want to share is the use of brush aggradation bundle structures, which was a bit new to me. And these are going to be installed approximately halfway between the Maine low water and Maine high water, and they're like the wattles that we showed earlier with the live stakes. They are long bundles of brush and branch cuttings that are bound and tied together and then placed between timber piles. So similar to most of these living shoreline techniques, they can break up the slope, they can replenish material, and then as they break down over time, you're allowing the area to naturally revegetate. So just a few lessons learned I wanted to highlight so far. based on the Cross Lake project, it was great to see that there are consultants out there with experience to work on these projects. We're finding that contractors are harder to find, but there are some out there. And then just the social aspect of this is that we have to kind of set expectations with landowners that, well, I didn't mean to, I guess, challenging or changing mindsets, that these techniques are multi-year processes. They do require more maintenance, but then they do eventually become self-sustaining. So landowners kind of have to be aware of that, and just that the aesthetic of it, it may not be what the typical norm is, or what we saw in some of the earlier photos Peter had in his presentation, that this kind of messy and beautiful buffers and natural techniques can be kind of the new aesthetically, pretty kind of an understatement, I guess, beautiful shorelines. So I did include some resources. I'm happy to share this presentation for folks if they'd like these resources. And that's all. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Addie. That was great, great addition. You know, great to have you and Peter work this together. It does make me think. I worked on a lot of forestry issues before, and I always found it fascinating. I worked on this forest stewardship program in Montana where landowners would come in and give their goals for their property, and everybody wanted a nice clean forest with nothing on the ground. And then we would talk about wildlife habitat and the value of having a messy forest, and everybody would leave the workshop a week later. You know, it was a multi-day workshop, and they'd leave with their goals totally changed, of having, you know, they wanted dead logs and dead leaves and downwoody debris on the ground. And I feel like the same thing is true with shorelines, that once people learn kind of the value of that shoreline for wildlife and other purposes, their aesthetic does change. So we are here to make the messy as appealing as we can. To make the mess appealing is what we're really trying to do. So a bunch of great questions. Thanks, Peter, for answering some of them. You know, Peter gave some great typed answers. A couple things though. First I want to be sure to mention that Jeremy Deeds is speaking. His webinar is on May 18th, and he's talking about the littoral zone and the modeling work that he's done. And I think it really relates to this presentation because he talks about, he's modeled the value, you know, the habitat quality of the littoral zone is directly related to the habitat quality in the buffer. So that'll be a really good presentation for anyone who's interested and has been intrigued by this topic. So come back on May 18th. So I want to make sure I mention that. So a couple questions. Are there, well, there's a lot of questions. Sources for the materials that you mentioned, Peter, and Addie, you mentioned too, like the coconut rolls or the live steaks. Are there good sources for those in Maine that you know of?
Well, I can answer. I can certainly answer that one, Susan, because I worked for E.J. Prescott, retired from there in the year 2020, and they handle coconut fiber logs and have for many years. They've done a lot with them, particularly on Cape Cod, in coastal environments, seacoast. But I know E.J. Prescott is one company in Maine that definitely handles those products.
Okay. Well, and I feel like Maine Lakes should be a resource for people. So I think what we'll do is follow up with you. For Lake Smart folks and others, having some sources for materials would be great, like for live staking. Is it as simple? Thank you to Lauren. She snuck in the chat, which was really helpful. She listed some of the species that are good for live staking. So she included, hold on, I just saw it. She included red osier dog. Wow, I don't know why sometimes, okay. So here's some of the things that our attendees have thrown out. Sometimes my chat gets really small. Okay, some native species that Lauren recommended. She's does a lot of erosion control advising, technical advising for LEA. Red osier dogwood, pussy willow, and black willow as 3 species. Do you have any others to recommend? And is it as simple as cutting off a branch of, like if you have pussy willow and you just slice off a branch, can you just stick it in the ground, or is there more to it?
So I can try to answer this. So Lauren, yes, I went to a live staking workshop with Lauren a couple weeks ago now, and because I kind of was under the impression that it was a very simple process, and it is in a sense. So some takeaways that I learned was it's nice to go out. So you have to plant in the dormant season. So you need to collect them and then install them hopefully within 24 hours, unless you're able to kind of keep them in a cool place and keep them dormant before you install them. But so what we some takeaways is that going out and identifying those species, and because we went in the winter and it's a little bit harder to identify them, identify species in the winter than it is in when there's leaves and flowers on the trees. So, and then so once you do find them, the key thing that, thanks to Lauren, is that the reason that you need to collect them when they're dormant is that the buds, so when you, do my best to explain the way Lauren did, the buds are they don't know at the time when they're dormant, whether they will kind of leaf out or if they can become roots. So they need to remain dormant. So then when you install it, the ones at the that go into the ground can then essentially like understand that they need to become roots, and that the ones above can bud out and leaf. So you ideally want to install these in the dormant season. So in the early spring or late fall.
Okay, that's great to know. So anyone who's thinking about that, maybe this summer, spend some time looking around for those source stakes for the fall. I mean, yeah, for this time next year, for installing them. Somebody asked a question about, really good question. I'll just read it verbatim, but it relates to this too, for stakes, because in terms of regulations around live staking. So are there regulations around live staking, or can you just put as many in as you want? Is one question, and I'll just double up because they're related. And then John Eliasberg asked, is there a simple explanation of the rules for clearing vegetation in the shoreline zone? And in promoting buffers, he says, I find it complicated to explain the regulations. And he's a Lake Smart evaluator. So, and I have the same problem. So I don't know if Alex is here and wants to get on to address it, or Addie, what? Do you have any?
So I will say that in my presentation, I intentionally included resources to our permitting folks, because I'm doing my best to learn all the rules and regulations myself. And I don't want to misquote any of our regulations. But I believe that when you're kind of planting in that 75-foot setback, that if you're disturbing the soil, then you would need a permit by rule. But I think the interesting thing about live stakes is you're essentially just kind of creating a small little hole to stick them right in. So in an ideal world, I would know the answer, but I'm hesitant to give an answer that is incorrect.
Well, we'll see about maybe Alex, and I didn't introduce you, Alex, and I'm not sure of your title. I just know you as the new Wendy Garland. So
that works perfect.
Our audience might like to know. Our audience might like to know your real title. So
my real title is the NPS coordinator at DEP, which was
now
Wendy,
I know,
and now I'm the new Wendy. But I think what Addie said is really on point, in that live staking kind of falls in a funny place, because in fact, everything that we're talking about with living shorelines kind of falls in a funny place. It's not quite, it doesn't really quite meet up to the permit by rule standards, because it's not riprap, right? And it kind of falls outside of what a full NERPA permit might be as well, because it's pretty small, right? Within the confines of the NPS program, our projects are typically not, they fall outside of that umbrella as well. So I think with regards to the live staking, there isn't a lot of soil disturbance that occurs, and it could be considered de minimis as long as it's just live staking and not anything else. But with regards to John's question, before I left DEP and came back, I was at DEP the first time, I was doing shoreline zoning. So the whole question about how much you can actually clear is very sticky. I mean, because technically you're supposed to leave a vegetated buffer, you know, and that vegetated buffer was ostensibly for sedimentation and phosphorus reasons. Now we know that there's a lot of other habitat reasons to continue having a buffer. But so the rules for clearing, are we talking about like big trees? Are we talking about duff? Are we talking about small little plants? I mean, the general rule of thumb is that big trees, there are certain standards that you have to meet, but everything else on the ground, you should probably leave. At least that's what I used to advise people to do.
What about for some of this, like if homeowners have undercut banks? Somebody asked about specifically, and Peter answered a written answer, but if you have if your bank's being undercut, say, and you want to try to use the coconut rolls and some of the fabric, you or a homeowner really cannot do that. I mean, do they really need a contract? So I know the DEP certifies contractors who can work who are certified to work in the shoreline zone. So anyone listening who is looking for a contractor, you should definitely find a contractor on that list, because I have seen some really horrible work in the shoreline zone from when people don't know what they're doing, and it just like incredibly bad stuff is done out there. So definitely look at that list. But you know, what is a homeowner to do if they have a small project? You know, if they have a small erosion problem on their property and they see some of these solutions today that look like they could work, what should they do?
So I guess I can try to answer part of that while I try to scroll through my email to find the best answer. But for the Watchuk Lake project, for instance, that's core log. So that we went back and forth with land folks that do the permitting, and that falls under a permit by rule. I believe it's, I was trying to figure out what section permit by rule is. So that's a smaller or a less intense process. So it's a kind of you're kind of notifying the department of what you intend to do. And as long as it follows the kind of guidelines and you follow, I guess, the protocols, then it could it can be done just through that process, and it's a 2-week time frame for them to respond to you about it. And I can try to figure out what section of permit by rule it is, and if it has to require a contractor or if the landowner. That would be probably in the guidelines of the permit by rule, but I can do my best.
And we can also, well, we'll send a follow-up email to everybody who attended today, you know, thanking everybody for coming, and you know, we can provide those links, Addie, that you had at the end of your slideshow. And, you know, if we, I think we can follow up too on this question. I know it's not a question that's not a it's not a 1-minute answer, I know, but it's definitely something we all struggle with in terms of how to communicate to landowners what they should do.
Right. I think that the most important thing is to start that conversation, because there's so many other possibilities that might be happening with the undercut bank. I mean, is it because of boating? Is it because of ice? Is it because, you know, and all those different reasons have different solutions. And, you know, just saying a core log right there may not really work. I mean,
solve the problem.
Yeah.
And if somebody wants to figure out that solution, would the DEP permit office be the place to get some advice about how to answer that question?
That's a good question. I don't know, Addie. Do you think the field services folks are up on this kind of stuff? Or?
On kind of determining the cause of it?
Yeah, or even suggesting techniques, or would watershed be more of a...
I feel like there are times when we kind of go to a site together. I know that they're slightly kind of understaffed and trying to get ramped backed up and be available and accessible to do kind of those more technical visits to provide what to do as opposed to just their enforcement side of work. But I think a combination of kind of us being able to provide those, what the BMP conservation practice should be, and then they can kind of guide us through what kind of permitting would be needed. There are some that are really, I'd say that most people are really knowledgeable. Some I know worked in like various, I think with other lake organizations, so have come from that experience and that background. We did, and maybe it'd be a good idea to kind of do a brief talk with bringing some of those folks in on the permitting side to kind of answer some of these questions, perhaps. Might be helpful to, yeah.
Well, and then I'll ask Peter, I guess, as a consultant, like, I mean, a lot of the projects that you highlighted and Addie highlighted are pretty large scale. So, you know, and just like you said about for invasive species prevention is much cheaper, more effective, cost effective. And the same potentially goes for erosion, right? If you nip it in the bud and control it early and fix it early. So for these smaller projects, you know, do you have, do you know of consultants who could go visit a property and consult on smaller projects? Or is that I get the feeling that's not something that's readily available here.
Yeah, I think definitely, and maybe as part of the follow-up here, Susan, you could go ahead and you could include my email if you wanted, and people could contact me. But depending on what part of the state they're in, I think I could probably help people find either a small contractor or you know, somebody that could help them. Here's the worst case scenario is that a person in Madawaska calls an engineer in Portland and wants them to do a small project on a pond in Madawaska. Well, logistically, we're already in big trouble, right? Because from Portland to Baltimore, Maryland is the same distance from Portland to Madawaska. So a lot of these big people, they shy away from things like that. But there are smaller consultants, smaller contractors who could probably handle something like that better. So that's, we have that problem logistically in Maine, and maybe if I can help some folks with that, I'd be glad to try.
Yeah, and I wonder if too, there's a role here for Maine Lakes or lake associations to get multiple homeowners together. I mean, I know that, you know, that kind of like what DEP does through the 319 grant program when you have a watershed survey, but, you know, lots of lakes aren't going to qualify for a watershed survey, but still have NPS problems. So, you know, that's a possibility too to think about for the future is for us potentially to help lake associations. And, you know, if you got a few landowners together who, you know, wanted to address problems together and you got a consultant to do a larger stretch or shoreline, maybe you can make it more affordable for everybody.
I was just at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and that exact question was asked of Mary Beth Richardson from DEP. You know, it's very expensive, and the person said, hey, it's very expensive for like 10 neighbors to all go out and each one to try to come up with a design, but could there be some accommodation for people working together? And she said, absolutely, there's room for that. So, so getting people to work together on a common solution. So if I'm on a lake and I've got a little postage stamp lot that's next to, you know, 50 others, our problems are all probably very similar, and we could probably all be working together towards a solution. So that's a really good thought, Susan. And yeah, for your association to eventually be a place where people could come for that kind of information, I could see that being real valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks. I think we answered most of the questions. Somebody pointed out, and I think probably a lot of the viewers here who are like smart folks, you know, Peter, in your slides, there weren't a lot of trees in your sort of recovered shorelines. And I just wonder if you could speak to the value of trees in the buffer zone. I know you mentioned at the beginning and you typed an answer to Roy, but just for the rest of the folks listening.
Well, yeah, the real value of trees is, and again, look at visit a lake sometime that's been relatively undisturbed and check out the number of trees that are right at that water's edge. And then think about thousands and thousands of insect larvae that drop into the water that feed the fish, that feed that natural cycle. And we see this everywhere. We see this, the same phenomenon when they, when dams are removed, for example. And now the fish species that were blocked are freely navigating back and forth in the way that they have traditionally. Suddenly they see there are more birds. The plant population starts to come back. The whole natural cycle kind of rebuilds itself. So trees perform a huge positive function around lakes. So the more we can incorporate those, the better. And it's also, a lot of people kind of have a thing about, oh, if I put up a lot of trees, I'm not going to have a view of the lake. Well, there's also ways that you can do that are very creative, with things like birches and so forth, where you can actually have a high canopy, but you got great visibility through the birches. So lots of huge benefits, and definitely, I think, again, the reason I put in my typed answer was quite simply that a lot of the slides focused on the construction aspect, and you're not going to see mature trees at that time. You're going to see more construction details of what we were building.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, I think we are always pounding the message that you need trees in the buffer to make it effective. So, well, that was a ton of information. Great questions from everybody, and thank you all for letting me put you on the spot. Clearly, there's more work for us to do to help people figure this out. I think, Addie, I think you have to come back next year. Hopefully we'll have an in-person conference next year. It would be great to have, Peter and Addie, both of you come back, and when we're in person, we would love to have like some demos, Peter, of bringing the materials and demonstrating how they work. We're hoping to have our conference in China Lake at the China Lake Conference Center. That's the plan. And Addie, it would be great to have a report back of some of those projects you mentioned and hear about more that are in the pipeline. It's really exciting. I know these are 319 grant specific practices, but it seems like, and Maine Lakes is certainly 100% on board in promoting them as the preferred approach, just because, as Peter said, mimicking the natural shoreline is really the best thing we can do. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for everyone for listening. There'll be a recording online. It'll be on our webpage. We'll follow up with an email in the next couple of days, provide more resources, share this with others who you think would benefit from this information. And I hope to see you in a couple of weeks. We'll be talking about, in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the economic value, economic benefits of Maine's lakes, which will be a little shift from what we've been talking about, but will be a really good presentation as well, and come back in May for Jeremy's littoral zone talk. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you for the opportunity, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.